Australia's Labour Prime Minister, John Curtin.
I'm happy to be back in Australia. I've seen many things and many places. And although every man can be forgiven for loving his own country best, I believe it is an impartial assessment of the facts to say that I have not seen any country or any people better than my own.
Welcome to Curtin's Cast, the John Curtin Research Centre's podcast, brought to you by myself, Nick Doranforth, and Redbridge's Cos Samaras. Each week, we bring you the freshest and most challenging conversations from the world of Australian and global politics, culture and ideas. G'day and welcome back, Curtinistas, to Curtin's Cast, the John Curtin Research Centre's podcast of politics, culture and ideas and people. We've got a fantastic person today. I'm Nick Doranforth, head honcho of the JCRC, and welcoming back my co-host, the Don of Data, the master, the maestro, the boss of Redbridge Group, the undisputed heavyweight champion of Australian polling, Kung Fu Cos Samaras.
Wow.
Kalimera.
Good morning, mate. And you sound like the announcer of the UFC fight yesterday, which I was watching. Here we go.
See, I didn't get it.
Cos is going to come out with boxing gloves after that.
Cosy, we've got a belter of an episode this week. We'll be discussing social cohesion, the rise of left and right-wing populism, the pressures of frontline politics and what it's like to be a marginal seat MP in 2026, and how Labor navigates defence policy, Ukraine, Trumpism, terror in the age of hyperpolitics. I love that. I've just discovered a new term, hyperpolitics, Cos, a book that I'm about to read. We might discuss that on a future episode. This week we're joined on Curtin's Cast by Peter Khalil, Labor MP for Wills since 2016. 10 years, VK. Yeah. Wow. The first Coptic Christian elected to federal parliament. He is the Assistant Minister for Defence and was Australia's first special envoy for social cohesion, the son of Egyptian Coptic migrants who grew up in public housing in Melbourne's north. Peter's story runs through the international tennis circuit. I think you beat Mark Philippoussis at one point. He was once ranked top 25 in Australia and a junior Australian Open competitor. His work has taken him to Baghdad during the Iraq War, advising on national security, to Kevin Rudd's principal national security advisor. I'm not sure which role was more brutal. Peter Khalil, welcome to Curtin's
Good morning.
Cast.
Good morning, Nick. That's a very nice introduction. Good morning, Cos.
Good morning.
Not as good as Cos's introduction. I was expecting a bit more of that, Rocky style intro, but that's okay.
We soften you up, mate.
Yeah.
Peter, I want to start with you. Your background as the son of immigrants, growing up in Housing Commission, and as a young tennis player who beat, was it Mark Philippoussis, or am I just making that
everyone
up?
keeps talking about that. We were in juniors. It wasn't that big a deal.
That's all right, mate.
Now, Mark went on to much bigger and better things on the circuit.
Tell us about your growing up in Melbourne's north as a son of Egyptian Coptic immigrants, how your journey shaped the man that you've become. And I'm particularly interested in why a good working class boy was what you were doing playing tennis,
Well, that's a good
the
question.
sport of toffs.
No, well, first of all, let me address that, because tennis in Australia was quite egalitarian. Everyone played tennis at your local clubs, in the regions. That's why we had so many good tennis players. In Europe and in America, it was a sport for the upper middle class, but in Australia, actually, tennis was available to all. You could pay your $5 and go down and become a member of the local club and play. That's changed, by the way. It's much more difficult now to access the sport. But certainly in the 70s and 80s, it was much more egalitarian in the sense that many people played the sport. And being a migrant, son of migrants, I mean, it's not a unique story. I think millions of Australians have experienced this in different forms. And we've all sort of added to that kind of story, the Australian story, the quintessential Australian story. But it's the similarities that you have with the Greek Australians, the Italian Australians, the Lebanese, all the Vietnamese Australians, all the people that came in the 70s, 60s, 70s and 80s and worked really hard for their kids. And they sacrificed a lot. My dad was a lawyer in Egypt, but he couldn't practice law here because it was a different system. He ended up working the railroads, the trams, and then for Australia Post for 27 years in the sorting room and so on. Mum worked as a kindergarten teacher and things like that. So they worked hard for my sister and I to give us a better life. And they were always banging on about education. Get a good education. Make sure that you, get a good education because it'll open up the doors for you and opportunities for you. So they kind of sacrificed their own careers and their lives for us, which I think is a common story.
And also very familiar migrant story in terms of the experience of your dad, right? So highly qualified, comes over here and goes from being a lawyer in one country and ends up in blue-collar occupations here. And that's still to this day a problem in this country, how we don't successfully as a nation tap into migrants' natural resources as in their skill sets.
Oh, that's 100% cause. And how many times do you still talk to a taxi driver who is either an engineer or a lawyer or a doctor in their home country and is driving around the taxi or the Uber now?
Right.
And the frustration of that. And unfortunately, I think for the second generation now, it's becoming a real problem because they look up and they see their mum or their dad, struggling, and they're like, why should I bother getting an education? But at least for us, we had the kind of, in the 70s, 80s, we had the Hawke Keating period. I remember talking to Bob because he was the previous member of Wills, and I went to ask him some advice about how to be a good member for Wills, and he said, I don't know, mate, I was Prime Minister the whole time. But I said, what was the main thing that really, you were proud of besides all these great things that you did in foreign affairs, which we talked a lot about that. But he said it was the policies he put in place to allow people to, I think when he started in 83, there was probably about 10 or 20% finishing high school. And by the time he finished in 91, about 70 or 80% of kids were graduating. So he was quite proud of that educational pathway. So we had that, and we had that opportunity, and we could, even with the HEC system, we could go to university, get a degree and open those doors up. The concern now is how difficult it is for second and third generation, particularly migrants, to access that at the present time. So that shaped me a lot. And what was remarkable about my dad, you were asking Nick and Mum as well, because she was at university in Egypt as well, and she came here and she had to do various jobs. She worked at the Mint. She did a lot of different things. Even he used to say to me, everyone says Australia is a lucky country, based on that Donald Horne book, which is somewhat ironic, right? Because he was talking about the sort of second-rate leadership in Australia and how lucky we were with our resources and all the other natural advantages that Australia had. And so Dad used to say, everyone says Australia's a lucky country, but no, we're the lucky one. He said, we're the lucky ones to be Australian. We've been given this opportunity.
Yeah, we've won the lottery of life as Coslos.
Security, prosperity, stability. They fled Egypt where there was war, persecution, upheaval. And so even in that context, even when he was experiencing racism, which he did, as Wogs did back then, he was still able to say to me, give something back to Australia. So I didn't think about that much at the time, but I think that's where the idea of public service or giving back to the society or making it better for others kind of stemmed from, was that commitment. And it's even more remarkable now that I think back on it because of the struggles that he had and Mum had, giving us that better life and the prejudices that they faced. And even despite that, he still said to me, he was still able to say to me, give something back to the country that's given us so much.
Exactly. Peter, just explain to listeners, who exactly are the Copts? So you come from an Egyptian Coptic background.
Wow.
A lot of people would just think, it's just another branch of Christianity, but it's more than a religious identity, isn't it?
Well, it's an ethnic identity as well.
Yeah.
The Coptic means Egyptian. Yeah. And so in ancient Egypt, when, the Christianity came to Egypt, the Egyptians converted. For some 400 or 500 years, they were largely Christian in Egypt. Then the Arabs invaded Egypt in 642 AD, and most of the population that got converted to Islam as well. The Christian population, that's probably about 10 or 20% in Egypt now, is Coptic Orthodox Christian. And so even one can argue there's an Egyptian identity or a Coptic identity regardless of religion. People have an ethnicity that, dates back along the Nile Valley for tens of thousands of years. So it's a very strong identity. I think it's interesting because in other parts of the region, there's an artificialness to the state boundaries, whereas Egypt was always kind of a nation state for thousands of years in ancient history. The Greek state's a bit different because they kept fighting each other. They couldn't quite build empire. The city states established. That Greek identity was there, but there were Ithacans and Thracians and Spartans, and everyone was all killing each other all the time. Made for good drama and tragedy. But that Egyptian identity is tens of thousands of years strong. So that's an interesting difference.
Peter, you've had a stellar career, and one of the things I like about you, you came to federal parliament as, a pretty fully formed human being. You'd held, lots of executive positions, I think at the SBS, been a multicultural commissioner. You had a fabulous career. You'd done the work there in Iraq. You had a job at the Brookings Institute. Great career, more time for family.
Why?
Why on earth did you choose to go into public life and politics?
Why would you do that?
Which is so brutal, and it's become more brutal. You've been there for 10 years now. It has become more brutal. It's
a great question, and it's one that I think many of us struggle with all the time. Two reflections. I think the first is that I think it is an advantage to have other experiences before you enter into public service or public life through in politics. So, I worked in the private sector, I worked in the public sector, I was an advisor, I worked in academia, I did a lot of different things. I was at SBS as an executive. And that, when you say fully formed, I don't know if that's the right way of explaining it. It's just a lot of different experiences and a lot of different perspectives that help make you a better MP, I think, because you're representing the people, the community that you represent, and understanding the multitude of perspectives and being able to translate that into political action for them. So that, I think, the experience was a good thing. The second point relates to why. I think despite the cynicism around politics, and there's a lot of cynicism around politics, it is still the only space where you can take action that makes a difference to people's lives in a fundamental sense. You can do it in other parts of the private sector. You can do it in charity. You can do it in other forms of work, no doubt. But political action and politics, this is the other thing. I was thinking about this a lot. It's like people, even in your question, there's an assumption that, it's brutal and politics is terrible, and there's this cynicism around politics. And when people say things like, they're just playing politics, it's a diminishment. It's a negative connotation. It infers that there's something bad about politics. Actually, I'll say this: politics, coming from, again, from the Greek, the politica, from Aristotle, for the polis, which is the city-state that the Greeks formed, and the polites, or however you pronounce it, the citizen. That interaction between individuals in the public space, that is the interaction that we have with every individual in our society and every group that interacts. Now, in the private space, I'm not concerned about, Nick, how you organise your undies in your drawer. That's your private affair. It's colour-coded, whether it's, based on size. I have that. That's a family thing. That's internal. It's private. But in the public space, that's where all politics occurs. So even this is a political discourse in many respects. And the whole idea of it is being able to engage with each other in a way that allows us through our disagreement to have debate and then have consensus or form a view and take political action. Hence the representative democracy, which is somewhat different than the Greeks, where people put trust in us to actually take actions on their behalf in order to better society, to move forward, and so on. That is fundamentally important. In all my reading and study, I can't see a better form of government than the democratic system. Thank you for the Greeks for helping us with that. Thanks, Cos. But that is essentially it. Being able to take action, political action, to help people have a better life. And so all of it is politics. All the interaction is politics. And when people give it a negative connotation, they're also diminishing the idea of a democratic system of governance. And my question to them is, okay, are you inferring then that there's a better way to do this? And what would that be? Is it the autocratic way where the dictator determines what you do and you have no say in it? What exactly is your alternative to this? I think it was Churchill that said, democracy is the worst form of government except for all the others.
Except for the ones that right. No, you're right. And we were talking about this yesterday. Come back to the strip strip down the definition of politics, politics is about how we collectively decide how we live together, who gets what, when, and how. It's that simple. If you give the impression that it is a brutal blood sport, it's more. It's obviously more than that, but
it should be. It should be metaphorically. Sorry to interrupt.
Yeah.
The distance between the Prime Minister and the opposition leader at the dispatch box in the House of Representatives, and it's based on what in the House of Commons, is a length of 2 sword lengths. So the idea there is, rather than picking up the sword and stabbing the other guy in the eye, you actually have to debate through almost a violent debate.
But
Paul Keating was very good at that.
Yeah.
Exactly. And you do it in a way, and that's the democratic process. So there's the adversarial approach and the competition and all of that is part of it. And when people say, question time, it's all this rubbish and stuff, there is something actually positive about that. It's much better that we do that there and we engage in that way than we're fighting in the streets when we disagree.
Well, the important point here is that as human beings, everything about who we are is political.
Correct.
And when people say to me, I don't like politics, well, you better check out of the human race then, because that's fundamentally the actual epicenter of what builds our societies. There's politics at the workplace, at the home.
Correct.
It's everywhere. And so then you have to decide as to how you conduct politics. As you say, Peter, in democracies, it's done in a civil way. There's 2 sword lengths. In other incarnations, it's violent and people die. And when people say, I don't like our current system, well, your alternative is pretty grim and it wouldn't guarantee you'll be safe, nor would your family. So I think we've got a pretty good system, and yes, it's got its faults, and yes, it's now under pressure by all sorts of external forces, but it's important to protect.
100%.
You've been living those forces on the ground there in Wills. Tell us a bit about Wills, and in some ways it's a microcosm of national politics. You've got, your major challenger is the Greens political party. I need to insert that phrase because it drives them mad. But there are also forces of the right who were in and about in Wills. What are voters actually telling you about politics in 2026?
Well, Wills is a remarkable electorate. Cos would know this too with some of his research around some of these electorates. It's a very diverse electorate. Almost 50% of the population have at least one parent born overseas. About 30% are born overseas. Italian, Greek, Lebanese, Turkish, and new migrants that have come in from Bangladesh and Pakistan and India, Nepalese. It has pretty much everything, and it's ethnically diverse. It's diverse to extent with faith, and it's also diverse in a socioeconomic sense because it stretches from North Fitzroy and North Carlton, which are economically or socioeconomically quite, high up on the scale, right up to Fawkner, which is one of the working class or the lowest median house prices in Melbourne. So it's very diverse. So representing the community in that, or all the communities in Wills, has been a really hard challenge, but one that I've embraced because it is a microcosm of modern Australia in many respects. I have pretty much everything in Wills except farmland, and I mean you could say Joe's Market Garden along the Merry Creek is kind of a farm, but apart from that, we have pretty much every socioeconomic background and every diverse background in the electorate, and it is very much a microcosm of modern Australia. And one of the key principles that I've tried to adhere to throughout is in balancing all the competing interests and the differences and the disagreements is to maintain the idea that despite those differences and disagreements, I'll serve that community, I'll serve the individuals, the groups, regardless of whether they voted for me or not, regardless of whether we disagree or not, because it is my role and responsibility as a democratic representative to represent them, but also fight for them and also deliver for them in many ways. And you ask, what are the people saying? That's hard to respond to that because people have different views. Every individual has a different view. It's the usual stuff, the economic points about, cost of living. We hear that all the time, obviously. There's a sense, though, I would say, and I'm being, trying to channel some of this, a sense of nervousness about how things are becoming a little bit more unstable across society. People are sick and tired of that kind of instability and that volatility. There's a sense of anger, particularly with the intergenerational You talk to younger people, it's like, the anger about, the boomers and others sort of having all these advantages throughout their history, and then them struggling and being less economically advanced than their parents or their grandparents. So there's that intergenerational unfairness. There's the jockeying and the positioning for all sorts of advantage that different groups and individuals have in any sort of society, seeking support for their services or their communities or their their particular interests. So it's a real challenge to juggle all of that. But I think the main principle is making sure that you represent everyone as best as you can.
That's been hard, particularly in the last 3 years, with the onset of the awful war between Israel and Hamas, and the terrible civilian toll inflicted on innocent Gazans, and that you have been at the coalface of that at times very ugly debate, and the real impact on social cohesion. As I said in your intro, you were the first special envoy for social cohesion. Some of my actually very intelligent progressive friends, talking about up at the level of professors, say, "Oh no, social cohesion is a rubbish bullshit term. Shouldn't use it." But it does. But it does matter.
Well, first of all, it doesn't really matter what you call it. If we're talking cohesion, is just a good way of describing
how we live together,
a set of principles or values that what we were talking about earlier with democracy, which is basically how do you engage with others within your community, within society, whether they be individuals or groups, and do so in a way that even if you disagree vehemently, you're able to do so with a level of respect or tolerance. I won't even use that. You basically are able to do it without resorting to violence, or resorting to incitement to violence, or resorting to incitement to hatred to the other group. What we've seen when cohesion breaks down, it breaks down because either individuals or groups start to demonize or dehumanize particular others and refuse to even engage. So then there's the breakdown of the politics that we were talking about earlier, the political space. The space between us is a space that allows us to engage, and our difference is there, our agreements are there, our consensus can be formed there. But in order to do that, you actually have to accept the other having a different opinion or a different viewpoint of the world and engage with that. You don't have to agree with it, but engage with it. Once the engagement breaks down, and it has with certain groups, people start to demonize or dehumanize the other to allow that breakdown engagement, and then violence ensues from there. Now, I've said consistently over the last couple of years, when it comes to protest, that's a fundamental democratic right that every Australian citizen has. It's part of their democratic rights, and they should be able to protest. And especially when people disagree or have a different view, they should protect that right to protest. When it crosses the line, though, into violence or a resort to inciting hatred to others or dehumanizing others and demonizing minority groups, that's not acceptable. And yes, it's covered by the law to a certain extent, but there's also a societal norm, a normative behavior around basic decency, which was I was talking about earlier, that ability to actually engage without dehumanizing the other and committing violence against them because you disagree with their view. So where that's occurred, that's been problematic, and I've called that out again and again. When it comes to social cohesion, what are we talking about? We're talking about a commitment that generations of Australians have made to an idea. What is that idea? It's an idea that we can come from all these different countries around the world, all these different faiths, and still live in a harmonious society. And that commitment, like my parents made it, I'm sure Coz's parents made it, yours, Nick, others, they came here, it was a new country, there was a lot of differences, but they committed to this idea that we could all live together, even if we disagreed with each other. Now that has broken down throughout our history. You saw when some of the Balkan wars occurred in the 90s, you had fights between the different groups there, and people like pushed back against that because they were bringing it here. It's broken down again recently. I mean, there's a lot of suffering in the world. There's the tens of thousands of people who've died in Gaza, the 1,200 Israelis who were murdered and massacred. There's hundreds of thousands of people died in Sudan. Yep. Every day that goes on, and Myanmar, and you can keep going. People have a right to be upset about that, to protest on that, to call for more action on whatever they need. That's not in question. But when they start to attack people based on their faith or based on their ethnicity and demonize them in that way and then resort to violence, that's when you have the breakdown of cohesion as a term.
And the commitment is all. I like that. Do you know who used that phrase? Bob Hawke, 1988, on the bicentenary of British settlement, colonisation, whatever you want to call it. He said, what defines Australia? He said, it's the commitment to Australia. That's it.
I didn't know that.
That's what he said.
I must have channeled Bob.
Channeled Bob.
Yeah.
His Kung Fu Cos wants to come flying in.
Yeah, that's right. The collapse of social cohesion, and whoever said that it's not really a proper meaning or doesn't mean all that much, they fail to understand that without it, as Peter touched on, you end up with violence. And sooner or later, minority groups feel they are being victimised and targeted to a point where they have no other recourse but to resort to violence. Now, growing up in this country, in the 70s and 80s, there were times where the racism was so bad that, yes, some people within our communities resorted to violence. I mean, there was a time in the 80s where if you really wanted to not get picked on because of being a Greek, Italian, an Egyptian, or whatever background you were, you enrolled in your local kickboxing gym and you learned how to fight because that was the only thing available to you as a teenager. We don't want that, do we?
No.
I mean, right? This is what we don't want our kids to follow in our footsteps, and that is that you become really well versed at hurting other human beings, because that's the point you've gotten to, where the intolerance is so extreme that your kid's only option is to put the gloves on. We don't want that, right? And this is fundamentally why social cohesion is so important to protect.
Well, because I remember that when I was growing up too, with the ethnics having fights against the skinheads, the neo-Nazis
Absolutely.
and so on, and that kind of burst out in the public space as well on many, many occasions. We don't want that. We've moved past that, but we're seeing a variation of this though, something different. And that is what I mean by that is that what I touched on earlier, when people start to stop believing that the other person and their view is in any way or should be in any way listened to or in any way accepted. That's what I mean by dehumanizing or demonizing, whether it's a Muslim Australian or a Jewish Australian or whatever it is, they're dehumanizing and demonizing that person because of their identity. So the identity thing has now surpassed even the basic engagement from in that political discourse between human and human to, oh no, because of their identity, they are collectively guilty for whatever that is done, and therefore that those persons are no longer going to be legitimate in the sense or allowed to even engage. Which once that happens, that allows violence to occur. It's the same thing that happened in totalitarian states where you demonized and dehumanized the outliers to allow them to be less than human and to be treated in that way. Like you saw that in Nazism, you saw it in communist Russia, you saw it in totalitarian states and autocratic and authoritarian regimes. That's how that minority is treated. It could be a political minority that resists or whatever it might be. That is the only way you can see the terrible things that human beings do to other beings. Now, we don't want that here either, Cos. No. We don't want the violence between individuals, but we certainly don't want the idea that someone, because of their identity, can be put in that box that then the violence against them is legitimated in some way.
But we had a leader of a political party just last week do exactly that, which is basically tag every single Muslim Australian, right? And she did it on purpose. She knew what she was doing. She thinks she's appealing to a particular group of Australians. But what she's doing is she's dehumanizing millions of Australians.
And this is we've been fighting against this, particularly for the Muslim Australian community in my electorate, but it applies to other communities as well. If you can do it to one, you can do it to many others. We've seen that happen. And you talked about the commitment.
About anti-Semitism. It never doesn't begin and end with Jews. Once you let anti-Semitism, whether it comes from the extreme right traditionally or the extreme left, it never ends there.
Someone else gets added to the list.
Yeah. I would say too that if we talked about the commitment, which is the positive sense, the commitment that we make to a society of a multi-faith, multi-ethnic society where we can actually live peaceably with each other despite differences and navigate those differences through a democratic process, through political discourse and engagement in the public space. The flip side of that is what we've been talking about, which is this dehumanisation, whether it's anti-Semitism, whether it's against Muslim Australians, whether it's against LGBTQI Australia. It doesn't matter. You pick, a person and they get, or that group, and they get identified and dehumanised. That is what we're fighting against. And she, a particular politician, and others, whether you're saying they're conscious of what they're doing, they are sowing division, deliberately dividing groups based on identity and almost giving a permissibility to act against the individuals within that group or that identity to be attacked.
Yeah.
I was discussing this with one of our colleagues this morning around the politics and the strategy behind her comments. But I made one point, and I stand to be corrected on this, is that anyone who plays in this space, big urban Australia is going to punish you at the ballot box. There's going to be a reckoning. Diverse Australians are not going to tolerate this. And I don't think the political class has fully wrapped its head around the consequences of what is going on in this country right now. The anti-immigrant narrative, I can tell you, even in Indian and Chinese communities, they are red hot. We've never seen them so animated before.
And the Greens got punished for this as well. They played with fire, and a large chunk of sort of professional knowledge class, middle class supporters, part of their base, rebelled at the last election.
Yeah, I mean, I'm obviously referring to the coalition, thinking about whether it dances with One Nation. Right? And if it does that, and unfortunately for them, they've already done that. They've danced with her on this, and it's been picked up.
Yeah.
So if they think they can fix their problems in big urban Australia, particularly in Sydney, Melbourne, and to a growing extent, even in Brisbane and Perth, good luck to them, because there will be a down payment on this.
You make an interesting point about the politics and how they've made their bet on this and flirted, well, more than flirted on this anti-immigration side of things. My experience as well in the sense of which Nick was sort of referring to, is that a number of minor parties, not just the Greens, other minor parties, and from the far right and the far left, I saw an abrogation of their responsibility as democratic representatives or candidates to this idea and that commitment. They were willing to go to encourage, not ever directly encourage, let's be clear about that, but certainly encourage that kind of permissibility in some of the rhetoric that was put out there, and then sort of step away and not be involved when the violence occurred, because that's too far a step. But others took the violent acts. It's almost like the environment was created for that to be permissible. And I think there was a lack of responsibility in that, whether it was because they were trying to gain political advantage in some way, to stir up anger, to stir up that division, to stir up the kind of emotion in that respect. It's harder. I found it really hard to do the right thing. And it's always hard to do the right thing. When I say the right thing, what is the right thing? To try and unite people, not to divide people, to try and bring people together, to try and make a case for peace, to try and make a case that we can live together, to try and make a case that not every Muslim person or Jewish person is guilty because of what an action an individual took or other countries did on the other side of the world. It's hard to do that. It's actually really hard to bring that together. People want anger. And by the way, this is where the social media stuff comes in and the algorithms and everything else. That just exacerbates all of that and makes it harder. So the populace, the left-right populism and left populism gain traction because the platforms that they use aid and abet the outrage. It's like an outrage machine. No one wants to hear sort of a statement about being nice to your neighbour or embracing the other person even if they're different. Like that's kind of stayed now. There's an anger that's being utilised and manipulated by these populists for political gain, short-term, medium-term political gain, but they're doing great damage to our society in that sense.
I think this is high time for, governments to start regulating that space, just like they regulated newspapers, TVs. There are codes of conduct in place or other mediums, such as newspapers and TV and radio. They can't say anything on those platforms. They are bound by rules
Yep.
that are put in place by governments. Yet for some reason, we've just had this completely hands-off approach to social media as if it's this other thing.
I'll tell you what the reason is. These tech bros and these tech lords who are making billions of dollars have been very effective in pushing back on the idea of regulation in this space as if it's somehow different than all the other spaces and platforms that you're talking about, because it's not.
No.
Like, if a 15-year-old can't drive until they're 18 or a 13-year-old can't drive, why are they allowed to see content that is what we would consider only acceptable for adults or over 18 in other mediums, right? So the principle is the same, but they've been very successful in pushing back on this and making this idea that, oh, no, this is a new territory and a new space and so on. They're making billions of dollars off all of us and off the kids and everything else.
They're making money out of people's misery.
Yeah.
Yes, that's right. Billions of dollars in fracturing the societies in which they rely on for profit.
I had ideas when I was working with this on the social cohesion period when I was 6 months envoy for social cohesion. Obviously, we worked on the social media ban as part of it. We met with a lot of kids at school and talked through with them. I was even there at a couple of schools last week in my lecture talking to the kids about between 13 and 16 about the impact of the social media ban on them. And some of it really surprised me. Some year 10 students were saying they were all for it because they didn't want their younger siblings to go through what they went, which I found fascinating. They were conscious and self-aware of the damage that was being done. I had ideas too around even hardware phones that would be, and some of these exist now, where you can get kids just phone and text and they can't access the internet, or they limit the time on the internet, because that's a form of regulation that you're talking about, which I think is necessary, and only governments can do it. This is a case for social democratic governments to regulate an unrestrained market or an unrestrained space in the media that we're seeing cause damage, and I'm very much support that.
And Australia's actually been a forefront there. Obviously, we led the world on the social media ban.
Yes,
that's actually, when you think about it, it's another great example of Australia being a smart, creative middle power.
Correct. Well, you might get, some of the listeners might think, oh, you're cheerleading here on a Labor government, but this is one of the great things that we've done. Like, honestly, like, it's been followed by Norway and France and Sweden and all these other countries, and Germany, like they've all
Britain
just needed to break the dam. Someone to have the courage, or a government to have the courage to say, no, this is not an unrestrained free space where you can do whatever you want, like completely civil libertarian view of the tech bros or whatever. There is a need for some regulation to protect people from damage, from hurt. Like we do it everywhere else, on our vilification laws, on seatbelt laws that came in the 70s and so on. People resisted that, by the way, at the time. I remember, the data around that. There is a real argument for that, and the Australian Labor government has done this, and it's done a really good job.
I think there's now live debate around, whether it's Australia and the UK and Canada having discussions around what to do with the platform X, otherwise known as Twitter.
Yeah.
Because on that platform, the level of, I would say, racial violence is off the charts. It's completely
and there's pornography
unchecked.
there, Cozzy.
It's unchecked, right? And it's different to other platforms where they do have some regulations in place. It is completely unfiltered aggression towards anyone who they choose to gang up on.
This idea, because like we believe in free speech as a principle, freedom of expression, free speech, but it has never been totally unregulated under the law. Throughout the history of legal intervention around free speech, there's always certain limitations around it, and whether it's you can't shout fire in a cinema when there's no, I remember that case when I studied law. There are certain limitations to free speech. For some reason, as we've discussed in this space, it's been allowed to run wild, and that, I think that era is coming to an end. We're seeing that in Australia, in parts of Europe, and even in, maybe not so much in America at the moment, but like obviously there's going to be further change on this.
But it's difficult. The genie is out of the bottle, to use a phrase. Turning our attention to the geopolitics, like the influence of social media and algorithmic politics. I don't know whether I've just made up a term there.
Algorithmic politics.
But I'm running with algorithmic politics. I should write it because let's write a book on algorithmic politics.
That's an interesting idea.
Cos and Dr. Nick. But it has a role, look at the big conflicts around the world. Look at it's played a seismic role in the rise of MAGA politics and the return of Trump to the White House. It's played a role there on the ground in Ukraine, a conflict which you've paid special attention to. It's playing a role in this sort of ongoing internal rebellion in Iran to the point where the Ayatollah and the Revolutionary Guards shut down the internet.
Yeah.
Well, not for themselves, but for the broader poor Iranian population.
Oh, it's certainly and even in the sense that the way that social media has been used to influence populations with respect to some of these conflicts, whether it's Iran or other conflicts around the world, that has certainly been happening, and that you see that in some of the bots that spread different kind of messaging and information. I think when you talk about geopolitics, again, like radio was so important in the 1920s and 30s, and control of radio, which was prominent for some of those regimes that were taking power at the time, it was critical in disseminating information. It's the same principle. Control of it matters. Control of it even now more so because of its wide range and reach across communities, and then even into other populations that are transnational, and being able to influence their views around these wars, whether it's Russia's invasion of Ukraine, whether what was happening in Myanmar, Israel and Hamas and Gaza, Sudan, all of these places. So that is an issue that has to be factored in with what you call geopolitics or algorithmic. What would you call it? Algorithmic politics.
I've trademarked that.
You should. I can't use it. How to control that's interesting because there are a lot of misinformation and deception and other forms of propaganda have been spread through social media to try and influence populations in the West around certain conflicts overseas. And we're kind of like, we don't have the regulation in place. We can't push back on that. The point I wanted to make, though, about that was in our engagement in the world, as you mentioned us being a middle power earlier, we have a role to play with other countries that I think other middle powers, which everyone talks about the Carney doctrine that, with his famous speech. I'm not claiming credit here, but I'll say that I wrote a piece about this maybe about 6-7 years ago about what I call the middle power fulcrum, which is the idea that middle powers needed to band together. The fulcra is the leg of a chair in Latin, props up a table or a chair. That we needed to create a fulcrum of middle powers that actually work together to not only protect and defend a rules-based order that was to our advantage, or international legal system that was to our advantage, because we couldn't use force overwhelmingly to get our strategic objectives. We needed rules of the road that was abided by most countries, but also to evolve that rules-based order, to engage countries in our region, for example, in Southeast Asia, to have ownership over this and to see the clear benefit and advantage of having a international legal normative system that works to our advantage as trading nations and in our security frameworks and so on, and evolve that system, that architecture. And I made this whole case around multilateral kind of forms where you'd have 3 or 4 countries working together on different things like piracy or others. So it's kind of quite diverse architecture to make it happen. Anyway, I wrote all this ages ago, and I see the Canadian Prime Minister copying some of it. I wonder if he read my article.
Mate, take the credit.
Do you reckon I should take the credit?
Maybe his staff and advisors read it.
But the difference there is that it's also not about. It's like I wasn't just talking about China, and I was talking about the US and China. Both superpowers, major powers, diminish elements of that framework, whether it's the law of the sea and our security framework, whether it's WTO with Trump and his kind of disruption on that. Now, you can make an argument whether it's good or bad. That's a separate thing. I'm just saying that there needs to be a framework that is beneficial to countries like us, because our prosperity, Australia's prosperity, is very much predicated on a security and stability of the region that allows us to, trade with other countries in the region, and we benefit from that. So we want that security. We want to deter conflict. I, as Assistant Minister of Defence, we've been having more conversations publicly about why it is we do what we do. And I think there needs to be more forward leaning in on that. Maybe Cos might shake his head about that being an electoral advantage, but from a public point of view, explaining why we're investing in these capabilities, explaining that it's to deter conflict, not because we want to go to war, we want to actually avoid war. And we need the capabilities that are strong enough to deter adversaries from thinking that they could use force to reach their objectives. Now, that's a hard conversation to have, but I think it's an important one because it goes beyond just saying, oh, we're doing this for the jobs. Now, no offence against I love Mallee in South Australia. I love the South Australians, except when they're playing Collingwood, when the Crows are playing Collingwood. Great state. But all these jobs that are being created in Adelaide at Osborne shipyards and so on, that's fantastic for the South Australian economy. Do you reckon anyone in Sydney, Melbourne gives a flying whatever? Can I swear on this?
But they will care about being self-sufficient. And
yes, that's what they need to hear about.
That's right. Yeah. That's right. There is a growing sense that Australia has to band together, as you rightly point out, with other like-minded nations, because of what is going on in the US and the Trump administration is creating a lot of instability and impacting confidence amongst Australians around that alliance. But most Australians still want this country to be actually self-sufficient and able to protect itself.
Yes, and that principle applies to in manufacturing and national resilience when it comes to, our industrial base. Self-sufficiency, self-reliance is important where we can. I think Australians really understand that principle, and we're moving in that direction. And I've always argued that we should be doing that because bringing manufacturing home sounds like a sort of a left populist argument, but it's actually a national security argument in some ways, a national resilience argument.
It is indeed. Peter, we're running out of time. Final, most important question. You actually mentioned to me over the weekend that I didn't something. Obviously, a young tennis star. I didn't know you played VFA, VFL.
For a few games for Dandenong, the Redlegs, and
then
I played amateurs.
Each other. You're a little bit older than I was down at Port Melbourne.
Right.
And you brought up Collingwood. So the most important question: how's your team, the Dad's Army of the AFL? How are they going to fare this year?
I reckon they'll do well this year. I think Jordan De Goey is doing well on the track. And I just say, speaking about our history, the reason I barrack for Collingwood is because my grandparents were in the Housing Commission in Preston. Now, Preston and Reservoir is a big Collingwood recruitment area. So my auntie went to high school with Peter Dacos, East Preston Tech, I think it was. And she introduced me to Dakes at the Preston Fish and Chip Shop in 1979. I remember I was 6 years old. I met the great man. It was his first year.
Macedonian Marvel.
Yep. And I became a mad Collingwood supporter. And Dad and I used to go to Victoria Park every second Saturday, and we were members and all the rest of it. So it's in the blood. It's interesting, that tribal stuff I was talking about, the tribalism of belonging to a group and being part of the Collingwood army, right? We hate Carlton supporters, for example. But have you seen that much violence against Carlton supporters? It's more pity and sympathy at the moment.
I was a Fitzroy supporter, so everyone felt sorry for us. Peter, we've run out of time. Thank you very much for joining us on Curtin's Cast.
Thanks, Nick. Thanks.
Thank you, Kung Fu Cos. Thank you, listeners. Don't forget, you can check us out on YouTube, Spotify, and Apple. Don't forget to refer a mate. Cos, we're going to do something different today. Would you like to farewell listeners in Greek? Because we started off the episode talking about the immense contribution of Greek civilization to democracy.
Don't forget the Egyptians.
That's right. Look, I'll keep it to the English language and say, Afitizen.
Yasu.
Ciao and arrivederci.